Rewritten opening, 60 to 70 words. Your $500,000 investment could vanish without a trace, and that's exactly what happened to Cahokia's $2 billion wealth, in today's money. In 1100 AD, this city held more assets than London. By 1350 AD, 20,000 people simply disappeared, no conquest records, no burned ruins, nothing. The fires went out. For 650 years, nobody returned. What financial collapse erases evidence so completely that even archaeologists can't find it? Back to relight them. That absence, that deliberate choice to stay gone, is the detail the official record keeps sidestepping, and once you see why, everything you think you know about how societies collapse stops making sense. It's 1054 AD. In the floodplains of what we'd call southern Illinois, a stranger approaching from the east would have seen something that shouldn't exist. A city. Not a village. Not a cluster of longhouses. A city, with a central platform mound taller than the Great Pyramid's base is wide, surrounded by 20,000 people, wood smoke, the sound of thousands of voices, and a plaza so deliberately leveled that engineers today still can't fully account for how it was done without metal tools or the wheel. And here's the detail that stopped me cold when I first pulled this record: within 350 years, every single one of those people was gone. No graves marking a final generation. No burned layer suggesting invasion. The fire simply went out, and no one ever came back to relight them. That question, why didn't anyone come back, is the one nobody in the official literature seems comfortable answering. The city that outranked London lets establish what we're actually talking about, because the scale tends to get lost. Cahokia, at its apex around 1050 to 1100 AD, held somewhere between 15 and 20,000 residents within its central precinct. The greater urban area may have housed twice that. At that same moment in history, London held roughly 12,000 people. Paris, perhaps 25,000, but Paris had Roman foundations, centuries of accumulation, and trade routes stretching to the Mediterranean. Cahokia had none of that. It emerged, almost explosively, from a small farming settlement in the space of a single generation. Archaeologist Timothy Pauketat, whose fieldwork at the site spans decades, describes this founding moment as a big bang, a sudden, coordinated reorganization of the landscape that required enormous collective labor and, almost certainly, an ideology powerful enough to mobilize it. They moved earth. Staggering quantities of earth. Monks Mound, the central platform, contains more fill than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built in stages, yes, but the foundational construction happened fast. Rows of wooden posts were raised in precise astronomical alignments. Plazas were scraped flat across areas larger than modern city blocks. Someone had a plan. And enough authority to make thousands of people execute it. But this is where the record gets darker. What's buried beneath the grandeur in the 1960s, excavations beneath a ridge to the southeast of Monks Mound, a site now catalogued as Mound 72, revealed something that quietly unsettled the archaeological community and received almost no mainstream attention for decades. Beneath the body of a high-status male, laid out on a cloak of 20,000 shell beads, were the remains of 53 young women. Aged between 15 and 25. Arranged in rows. Physical analysis suggests they didn't all die at once, the burials occurred in phases. Some show signs consistent with strangulation. Others show evidence of having been brought from considerable distances, based on isotope signatures in their bones. This wasn't a plague burial. This was deliberate. In the records I've kept on Mississippian ceremonial practices, human sacrifice at founding moments isn't without parallel, but the scale at Mound 72 is exceptional. What it implies is a ruling class willing to extract the ultimate cost from its population, or from captured outsiders, to consecrate its power. And that detail, what it tells us about the social contract at Cahokia's heart, becomes essential when we try to understand what eventually tore the city apart. Because here's where the story turns. Everything I described so far, the grandeur, the engineering, the ritual authority, that's the version you'd find in most textbooks. 3 records I'll walk you through in the next 2 minutes overturn the comfortable official narrative, and the third one was effectively buried in unpublished field notes for nearly 60 years. The palisade that kept being rebuilt. The first record, Cahokia's palisade. Surrounding the central precinct was a massive wooden wall, 2 miles long, built from 20,000 logs, studded with regularly spaced bastions from which defenders could cover dead ground. Archaeologists found not one palisade, but 4. Built in succession, each one replacing the last. The official interpretation frames this as routine maintenance. Wood rots. Walls need replacing. But the spacing tells a different story. The palisades weren't rebuilt on the same footprint each time, they were rebuilt with increasing urgency, and the final construction shows signs of hasty execution. The post holes are less regular. The bastions are more frequent. And critically, the wall cuts directly through established residential areas, as though whoever ordered it built had stopped caring about the inconvenience to the people living there. This isn't maintenance. This is a city that became afraid of something, possibly its own hinterland population. The isotope record and the leaving the second record, bone chemistry. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains from Cahokia's later centuries, roughly 1200 to 1350, reveals something quietly devastating. The population wasn't just declining. It was leaving star. Strontium isotope ratios in teeth, which lock in the chemistry of wherever a person spent their childhood, show an increasing proportion of residents who weren't born at Cahokia. The people who were born there were going somewhere else. And those who remained were increasingly drawn from the periphery. The core population, the families who had built the city, who maintained its rituals, who passed down its cosmology, they left first. What few remember is that the river itself may have helped push them out. Flood layer sediment cores from the American bottom, analyzed by researchers at the University of Wisconsin, show a catastrophic flood event around 1200 AD, followed by a prolonged period of unstable, unpredictable flooding. The agricultural fields that sustained the city, already under pressure from soil depletion, became unreliable. A city that couldn't feed itself had already lost the most important argument for staying. The detail hidden for 60 years, now the third record. And this one requires some care. In the early excavations of Cahokia, conducted by Warren King Moorhead in the 1920s, field notes described several cache pits in the outer residential zones containing what Moorhead catalogued vaguely as ceremonial deposits, objects gathered and deliberately buried, apparently in haste. His published report mentioned them only in passing. What I found in the archives, specifically in unpublished correspondence held at the Peabody Museum, is that several of these pits contained objects that weren't Cahokian in origin. Trade goods. Items from cultures to the south and east. And some of the pits showed evidence of burning directly over the deposit, as though someone had sealed them, deliberately, against retrieval. People burying things they intended to come back for and then didn't. Or people destroying things they didn't want left behind. Moorhead chose not to foreground this in his published work. His correspondence suggests he found the implication troubling, that Cahokia's final residents weren't simply drifting away. Some of them were leaving in a hurry, and some of them were making sure certain things couldn't follow. Why nobody came back? So we return to the question that opened this record. A city of 20,000. Empty by 1400. And in the following centuries, as other Mississippian cultures persisted, as trade networks remained active, as the landscape didn't fundamentally change, nobody resettled it. The mounds were visible. The location was known. The soil, while depleted, wasn't poisoned. The most credible answer emerging from recent scholarship isn't geological or epidemiological. It's cultural. Cahokia appears to have become, in its final century, a place associated with coercion, failed ritual promises, and possibly catastrophic violence. The social memory attached to it was not one of glory. It was one of extraction, of labor demanded, of women sacrificed, of crops that stopped coming, of walls built to keep something at bay that the walls didn't stop. Abandoned places get resettled when they represent opportunity. Cahokia, it seems, represented something else. Something people prefer to remember from a distance. The mounds are still there, rising out of the Illinois floodplain, a few miles from the Gateway Arch. They're a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Most Americans have never heard of them. That silence, the gap between what Cahokia was and how little it occupies our historical imagination, is itself a kind of record. The archivist's job is to read it. What was buried at Cahokia wasn't just the dead. It was a question about what a civilization owes the people who build it, and what happens when the answer isn't good enough. Well, if this record is worth keeping, subscribe. A new file opens every week.